The Galactic Academy, a prestigious institution known for producing the most diplomatic and tactically astute minds across the galaxy, was quiet. Rows of alien students filled the classroom, their eyes fixed on the holographic display as Professor Veldrin, a renowned instructor from the peaceful intellectual species known as the Zereth, prepared for another lecture. This was no ordinary class. It was a diplomacy class, where the most advanced species in the galaxy honed their skills in negotiation and peace-building. Professor Veldrin stood tall, his multi-limbed form exuding an air of authority. His species prided themselves on their calm demeanor and vast intellect, having lived without war for centuries. They believed in the power of words, reasoning, and persuasion, tools they used to navigate the intricacies of galactic politics. To them, the human race was a curiosity, primitive, emotional, and unrefined. In the front row sat Ethan McCallister, a human student, the only one in the room who had ever lived on a death world. Earth, his home, had shaped him in ways the professor could never understand. He had seen chaos, conflict, and had fought for survival from an early age. To Ethan, survival wasn't just a concept, it was a way of life. He had come to the Galactic Academy not to prove himself, but to learn. But little did Ethan know that today, his lesson would not be about diplomacy. Today, it would be about survival, a lesson that Professor Veldrin would learn the hard way. The class had been in session for an hour, and Professor Veldrin had carefully guided his students through the delicate intricacies of galactic diplomacy. The holographic displays around the room flickered with alien symbols, representing the agreements, negotiations, and treaties that had shaped the peaceful coexistence of species throughout the galaxy. All eyes were on him as he spoke with confidence, his multi-limbed form moving gracefully across the room. It was clear that he was respected, admired for his wisdom, and revered for his intelligence. Remember, Veldrin continued, diplomacy is not only about power. It's about the ability to empathize, to find common ground even with those you disagree with. The strongest civilizations like ours have mastered the art of negotiation, avoiding war at all costs. Ethan McCallister sat in the back of the classroom, his arms crossed over his chest. He had been listening intently, but as Veldrin spoke, a sense of frustration began to build within him. Humanity's history was not one of peaceful coexistence. It was a history of war, survival, and perseverance. Ethan knew that his people had fought countless battles, not for conquest, but for survival in the face of insurmountable odds. His instincts told him that there was more to strength than simply talking things out. Veldrin, noticing the quiet human student in the back row, turned his attention to him. "Ah, yes, McCallister, the human representative," he said with a dismissive smile. "You must surely agree that your people, with all their history of conflict and violence, have much to learn from the more peaceful species of the galaxy. It's no wonder humans are often seen as brash and impulsive." The room fell silent, and every eye in the classroom shifted toward Ethan. Veldrin's tone was lighthearted, but the implication was clear. He viewed humanity as a species too emotional and uncivilized to handle the delicate art of diplomacy. Ethan could feel the weight of every alien student's gaze, a mix of pity and superiority in their eyes. The professor's words stung, but what bothered him more was the blatant disregard for humanity's resilience, the unshakable strength that had allowed his species to survive against all odds. Ethan's hand clenched into a fist on the table, his jaw tightening. He had always kept a low profile in the academy, choosing to observe and learn. But today, something inside him snapped. He had had enough of this alien condescension, enough of the assumption that humanity's emotional responses were nothing but a weakness. Taking a deep breath, he slowly stood up from his seat, his movements deliberate and calm, yet filled with an undeniable intensity. "Professor Veldrin," Ethan began, his voice steady but carrying a hint of steel, "you assume that because humanity has faced wars and conflict, we are somehow incapable of understanding diplomacy or peace. But what you don't understand is that humanity's strength comes not from avoiding conflict, but from enduring it." Veldrin raised an eyebrow, amused. "Enduring conflict? That hardly sounds like a foundation for diplomatic progress." Ethan's expression remained unchanged as he continued. It's not about avoiding conflict, Professor. It's about surviving it, adapting to it. And when diplomacy fails, it's about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. That's what makes humans strong. His words were calm, but they hit with the force of a hammer. The room seemed to grow even quieter. Professor Veldrin's face, once confident and unflappable, shifted slightly. He had been expecting a quiet, obedient student, a human who would accept his teachings. But instead, he was confronted with something more, a human who had learned to survive not by running from danger, but by facing it head-on. Veldrin cleared his throat, though his voice was laced with sarcasm. Fascinating, McCallister. But if you truly believe that human history of violence and chaos will get you anywhere, then perhaps you're more primitive than I thought. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He had just been provoked, and the storm within him was only growing. What was supposed to be a simple class on diplomacy had now become a test of willpower and survival. Ethan stood taller, his hand subtly resting near his side where he could feel the weight of his sword hidden beneath his jacket. Professor Veldrin had no idea what kind of strength he had just awakened. The tension in the classroom was palpable. The students, many of whom had never encountered a human this defiant, exchanged nervous glances. They could sense the shift in the air. This was no longer a discussion about diplomacy. It was a clash of ideologies, a collision between intellect and survival. And Ethan was about to prove that survival was a force more powerful than mere words. The room was electric with tension. Ethan's words hung in the air, challenging the professor's ideals, confronting everything Veldrin had ever taught about diplomacy. For a moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that comes before a storm, when everyone knows something significant is about to unfold, but no one knows exactly what will happen next. Professor Veldrin's multi-limbed form seemed to stiffen, his eyes narrowing as he processed Ethan's words. He had seen many species throughout his long years, cunning tacticians, sharp minds, species whose diplomacy was unmatched. But he had never encountered one quite like Ethan McCallister. Humans, in his eyes, were emotional, chaotic, often out of control. But this human wasn't brash. No, Ethan was different. His words were calm, but there was a depth to them that struck a nerve in the professor's soul. Resilience, survival, knowing when to fight. Those weren't concepts Veldrin was used to hearing in the same breath as diplomacy. He expected humans to bow their heads to intellect, not challenge it. Veldrin's frustration bubbled to the surface. He could see the disdain in the eyes of his students, the disbelief that a human, a species considered beneath most of the galaxy's intellectual elites, would dare to lecture him, the respected professor. In the face of such insolence, it was time for action. McCallister, Veldrin began, his voice cold but tinged with irritation. If you think that human brute force can solve everything, then perhaps you've misunderstood the nature of true diplomacy. You've failed to understand that true power lies in restraint. If you insist on making a spectacle of yourself, then I will give you the stage. With that, the professor raised his hands, his eyes glowing with an eerie light as he activated the defensive barriers that surrounded the classroom. His voice grew louder, more commanding. You want a challenge, McCallister? You'll get one. But know this, I won't tolerate such primitive gestures in my class. Ethan's expression didn't change. He had been prepared for this. The instincts inside him, the instincts forged through countless trials and battles, were awakened, and now he was fully present in the moment. This wasn't about winning in the conventional sense. It was about showing the professor that humanity's strength wasn't always visible through intellect or reason. Sometimes it came through sheer will. And that was when he made his decision. Slowly, deliberately, Ethan's hand moved toward the side, where his sword was hidden beneath his jacket. The sword wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of humanity's history of survival and resilience. The blade had been passed down through generations of McCallisters, each one carrying the legacy of those who had fought to live, to adapt, to survive. The motion was subtle at first, but the tension in the air seemed to grow as Ethan's fingers wrapped around the hilt of the sword. The alien students watched in stunned silence as the human student, seemingly unperturbed by the professor's warnings, slowly drew the weapon from its sheath. The blade glimmered faintly in the light of the holographic screens, a sharp contrast to the peaceful classroom. Professor Veldrin's eyes widened for a brief moment, a flicker of surprise crossing his expression. He had underestimated the human resolve, thinking that his mere words and displays of power would be enough to intimidate McCallister. But as the sword came into full view, something shifted. The students could feel it too, an undercurrent of something much greater than mere conflict. This wasn't just about a professor's misplaced ego or a student's defiance. It was about human strength, about survival against all odds. The professor stepped back slightly, his alien eyes scanning the human student's face. "You think that drawing your weapon will prove your point, McCallister?" Veldrin scoffed, trying to regain control of the situation. "This isn't a battle of physical strength. This is a battle of minds, of diplomacy." Ethan's voice was calm, but there was an undeniable intensity in his words. "Sometimes, Professor, diplomacy is about more than just words. It's about knowing when to fight and when to stand your ground. Humans know when to fight." There it was again, survival. The one thing that separated humanity from the rest of the galaxy's peaceful civilizations. The moment had arrived. The confrontation wasn't just physical, it was ideological. Humanity's place in the galaxy wasn't defined by intellect alone. It was defined by their ability to endure, to fight for survival, to adapt when necessary. Veldrin hesitated, unsure of how to react. He had faced wars, battles, and conflicts across the galaxy, but never had he encountered a species that valued survival over negotiation so thoroughly. The human student, Ethan McCallister, had just forced the professor to question everything he believed about strength. With the sword in Ethan's hand, the fight wasn't just about proving a point, it was about survival. And now, in that moment, the professor knew this battle would not be won through intellect or energy shields. It would be won through the will to endure, a lesson that Veldrin was just beginning to understand. Ethan stood tall, his eyes fixed on the professor, his grip firm on the sword. The room was still, silent, expectant. The galaxy had always looked at humans as inferior, but this was the moment they would learn just how powerful human resilience truly was. The test had begun, and the consequences would be swift. Professor Veldrin stood still, his mind racing and his breath steady. The sword in Ethan's hand was a glaring contrast to the peaceful ideals he had spent his life defending. This wasn't the classroom he was used to. His confidence, which had once been rooted in centuries of intellect and peaceful negotiation, now felt fragile in the face of this unexpected challenge. He had made the mistake of underestimating the human, something that could not be allowed to continue. "Well, McCallister," Veldrin said, his voice firm, masking the uncertainty now creeping into his mind. "Since you insist on physicality, let me show you what true diplomacy looks like." He raised his hands, and the air around the classroom crackled with the power of alien technology. Ethan, still holding his sword with calm determination, narrowed his eyes. The challenge was set. Professor Veldrin was going to test him, but in ways Ethan didn't expect. This wasn't a simple physical contest. It was a battle of wills, a test of human adaptability against the alien intellect that Veldrin so fiercely believed in. Veldrin's multi-limbed form shifted as the first test began. Suddenly, a projection appeared in front of them, alien symbols floating in midair, forming an elaborate riddle. Veldrin's voice rang out, cutting through the tension. "To truly understand diplomacy, one must understand strategy, McCallister. Solve this riddle, and I'll concede. Fail, and we'll see how long that sword of yours will keep you safe." The riddle itself was simple to Veldrin. He'd solved such puzzles 100 times before, but to the human, it would prove difficult. Humans, after all, weren't known for their patience in the face of intellectual challenges. They were too volatile, too emotional. Ethan's eyes flicked over the holographic symbols. The question was clear, but the more he stared at the alien logic, the more his instincts kicked in. The riddle was a test of patience, something humans often struggled with in intellectual pursuits. But Ethan wasn't here to simply answer questions with his mind. He was here to prove that humans, despite their flaws, could rise to any challenge. He wasn't just going to rely on his intellect, he would rely on his survival instincts. Without missing a beat, Ethan's gaze shifted from the holographic riddle to the professor. He knew he could take the time to think through the riddle or test the limits of the professor's patience. But that wasn't how humans thrived. Survival wasn't about getting lost in intellectual traps, it was about action. You think diplomacy is about outwitting your opponents with riddles, Professor? Ethan asked, his voice steady. Humanity doesn't need tricks to win. We win by doing. Before Veldrin could respond, Ethan launched into the next challenge. The air around them suddenly became heavy, and the temperature dropped as the next test came into play. Floating above them was a holographic image of a galactic council room filled with alien representatives from across the galaxy. A situation had arisen. A fragile peace agreement was on the verge of collapse, and the alien leaders were demanding a decision. The task was clear. Ethan was to represent humanity and mediate this intergalactic conflict. But this wasn't going to be a normal diplomatic scenario. The council's factions were divided, and each alien race held very different views on how to proceed. Veldrin's challenge was not about Ethan's intellect. It was about how far he was willing to go to broker peace in the face of overwhelming adversity. The moment the simulation started, Ethan took a deep breath. His human instincts told him not to back down. He wasn't going to try to be diplomatic in the traditional sense, not like the peaceful alien species would expect. Instead, he chose to show what humanity could do when faced with conflict, fight for a solution, not just for compromise. Ethan spoke confidently, addressing each alien faction with a simple but powerful message. You can argue and debate all you want, but at the end of the day, if no one is willing to act, nothing will change. The room, filled with alien representatives, fell silent. The holograms flickered as the alien delegates seemed to process the human's words. Veldrin watched closely, unsure of what Ethan was trying to do. The human was taking the route that seemed most logical to him. Action. But would it be enough? Professor Veldrin's patience began to wear thin. The human had defied expectations already, but this wasn't the response he had expected from a student like Ethan. The professor moved to intervene, his multi-limbed form extending toward the controls of the simulation. But before he could reach them, something remarkable happened. The alien representatives, who had been on the verge of bickering and erupting into chaos, stopped. They began to listen, and the simulation shifted. The discussion started to become more constructive, with the factions acknowledging the human approach and reaching agreements that had once seemed impossible. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was progress. Veldrin's mouth went dry as he watched the scene unfold. It wasn't the riddle, it wasn't the intellectual game he had designed. It was action, survival instinct, and human will that had pushed the galaxy's brightest minds to compromise and make real decisions. Ethan had completed the test. But it wasn't with logic or intellect, it was with something far more human, the ability to act decisively and forge solutions under pressure. The professor stood there, his thoughts racing. Ethan had proven that diplomacy wasn't always about talking. It was about knowing when to act. And for the first time, Veldrin understood the true strength of humanity. It wasn't just survival. It was adaptability, the willingness to step up when it counted. Veldrin's expression softened, though his pride was bruised. He had underestimated humanity, but now he realized that humanity's strength was not defined by its past conflicts. It was defined by its ability to rise above them. And Ethan had just shown him how. The tension in the room was palpable, a quiet but ever-growing storm. Ethan stood tall, his eyes never leaving Professor Veldrin as the challenge continued. The simulations were over. The tests of intellect and diplomacy had failed to shake him. But now it was clear, words and tactics alone wouldn't win this battle. Something deeper, something more primal was at play. And that was exactly what Veldrin was about to discover. For hours, the class had been discussing humanity's place in the galaxy. Veldrin's usual method was to guide his students through scenarios, testing their ability to negotiate, to reason, and to avoid violence. Humans, in his mind, had always been brash, too quick to resort to physical action. And despite Ethan's calm demeanor, the professor couldn't shake the feeling that this human was hiding something, a darker edge to his character that might break the fragile balance of the classroom. Veldrin was trying to provoke Ethan further. He wanted to test the human's limits, push him to the point where he might snap, revealing that raw, impulsive nature Veldrin had been so sure existed in humans. He spoke loudly, eyes fixed on Ethan. "You've done well so far, McCallister. But diplomacy isn't just about solving problems with quick decisions and blunt action. It's about making others listen, controlling the room, and showing restraint. You can't win in the galaxy by relying on your primitive instincts. You have to learn the art of words. You must talk, not act." Ethan's face didn't change, but inwardly, he could feel his emotions rising. He had kept his calm, but now the professor was pushing him to his limit. Veldrin's words, primitive, brute force, and instinct, struck deep. It wasn't just about Ethan's intellect anymore. It was about his humanity, the core of who he was. For years, he had fought to survive, adapting to the most brutal environments. He knew the cost of survival better than anyone. But this was more than survival. The professor wasn't simply questioning his intellect. He was attacking everything Ethan had fought for. Humanity wasn't a species defined by intellect alone. It was shaped by its will to fight, to resist, to survive when faced with death. Ethan knew better than anyone that sometimes words failed. Sometimes the only thing left was action. And the professor was about to find that out. Ethan clenched his fist around the hilt of his sword. The action was subtle but deliberate, an acknowledgement of his own control. He could feel the surge of adrenaline rising in him, the years of battle instincts reawakening as Veldrin's words hit their mark. Ethan had never been the type to resort to violence first, but this was different. It was time to act. As Veldrin continued, oblivious to the growing storm inside Ethan, the human stood still, measuring every word that left the professor's lips. The words were an attack on his very identity, and Ethan knew that self-control was slipping. The test wasn't about outthinking or outspeaking the professor. It was about breaking the tension and showing that humanity's strength was in its ability to act decisively, to do what was necessary. "Words are just tools for those who have no other choice," Ethan finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "But when you've been through what humans have, sometimes the only thing that matters is whether you're ready to fight when the time comes." The room went silent. The alien students looked at each other, some intrigued, others unsettled. The human was finally showing his cards. Veldrin's expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. He was used to being the one in control, used to handling these kinds of situations without needing to exert physical dominance. But this time, something was different. Veldrin's lips curled into a slight smile, an attempt to regain his confidence. "You think your violence will solve everything, McCallister? You misunderstand. Diplomacy, true diplomacy, requires restraint, patience, and dialogue. Not this." He gestured toward the sword Ethan still held loosely at his side. Ethan's grip tightened on the hilt, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The professor had crossed a line. He had misunderstood humanity at its core. He had reduced the human experience to nothing more than violence. And Ethan McCallister would not let that stand. He didn't move at first. He didn't need to. The moment wasn't about aggression. It was about making a statement. He knew that the professor and the students needed to see that humanity's strength wasn't just in their minds, but in their hearts, and in their will to act when the galaxy itself seemed unwilling to do so. The silence stretched on, heavier now. Professor Veldrin stood poised, waiting for Ethan to make his move. But this time, it wasn't just about physical confrontation. It was about humanity's response to the crisis at hand. The students had seen Ethan stand tall, unfazed, focused. But now, they were seeing something even more profound. Ethan wasn't just a warrior. He was a symbol of human perseverance, of the ability to overcome any challenge, and of knowing when to stand firm and when to fight back. Finally, Veldrin spoke again, his voice now laced with uncertainty. You may think your survival instincts give you an advantage, McCallister. But what if I tell you that the galaxy doesn't care about your strength? Ethan looked at him directly, his gaze unwavering. The galaxy may not care, Professor, but humans will survive it, no matter what. With that, the lesson wasn't just about winning the battle. It was about showing the galaxy that humanity was more than primitive violence. It was about resilience and the power of action when words and reason fail. The breaking point had arrived, and it was clear. When words failed, humanity had a way of showing that actions would speak louder. The tension in the classroom was unbearable. The holographic displays flickered with alien symbols, projecting the complicated rules of galactic diplomacy. But none of them mattered now. The true battle had already begun. Professor Veldrin, towering and calm, stood at the front of the room, the embodiment of rationality and peaceful resolve. His forearms were folded behind his back, the way a teacher would stand before a classroom full of students, confident in his superiority. But now before him was Ethan McCallister, a human student from a world Veldrin had always dismissed as too chaotic, too primitive. The sword that Ethan had drawn was no longer a simple symbol. It was a statement, a challenge. Veldrin's mind, so accustomed to solving problems with intellect and patience, struggled to understand what was happening before him. For the first time in decades, the professor felt unsettled. His eyes, usually sharp and confident, betrayed a moment of doubt. Ethan had defied him with quiet strength, a resolve that was deeply rooted in his human experience, a connection to survival that Veldrin had underestimated. And as Ethan stood there, sword in hand, not moving but poised, the professor realized something crucial. This human wasn't playing the same game. Veldrin took a deep breath, the air humming around him as he conjured a field of energy, anticipating an immediate need for defense. With a snap of his fingers, he activated the classroom's defensive protocols. Holographic barriers emerged from the walls, casting a shimmering blue glow around him. The room seemed to pulse with energy, creating a safe bubble that protected the professor from any potential aggressive movements from Ethan. You truly believe that your primitive displays of strength will impress me, McCallister? Veldrin's voice was smooth, but the slightest edge of uncertainty lingered behind his words. You cannot expect to solve everything with violence. This isn't the way of the galaxy. Ethan didn't respond. His grip on the sword remained firm, but he made no move to advance. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the professor's growing impatience. Veldrin was a master of tact, a teacher who had seen and experienced things that would make most lesser beings tremble. But here, with a single human in front of him, he felt a tension unlike anything he had ever encountered. Professor Veldrin's patience was beginning to slip. He could no longer simply stand and lecture. Something in him demanded action. He wasn't accustomed to being the one questioned, especially by a student who had no apparent reason to challenge his authority. Ethan McCallister had pushed him to a breaking point, forcing Veldrin to reconsider his view of humanity. And now, he would take the next step. You still insist on this confrontation? Veldrin's voice became louder, commanding the attention of every student in the room. The alien students who had been watching the exchange shifted nervously in their seats. They could sense the growing tension between their professor and the human student. None of them had ever seen a human display this kind of calm determination. "I'll give you what you want," Veldrin declared, raising one of his arms high. The alien's multi-limbed form was a blur of motion as he summoned a surge of telekinetic energy from the depths of his mind. A shield of energy encased his body, shimmering like a liquid made of light. The room hummed with power, the force vibrating the walls as the professor prepared for an attack. Ethan stood still, his sword still sheathed in his hand. He knew what Veldrin was doing. He was preparing to defend himself. But Ethan had no intention of attacking in the traditional sense. He wasn't here to engage in a battle of pure strength or intellect. He had come to prove that sometimes survival wasn't about defeating your opponent through conventional means. It was about knowing when to use the tools at your disposal and when to let your actions speak louder than your words. Veldrin's gaze hardened. His energy shield shimmered with increasing intensity as he took a defensive stance. Very well, McCallister. Show me what you've got. Prove to me that humanity isn't just an impulsive species of reckless creatures. Show me that your strength comes from more than just sheer brute force. The room fell silent, the only sound being the hum of Veldrin's telekinetic barrier. Ethan McCallister stepped forward not with aggression, but with a quiet, calculated resolve. With a single motion, he drew the sword fully from its sheath, the steel glinting under the room's artificial light. As he did so, something incredible happened. The energy that surrounded the room, the calm silence, shifted in an instant. Ethan's presence, steadfast and unyielding, changed the atmosphere. The alien students watched, mesmerized by the raw strength in his posture. By the way, he stood not to attack, but to demonstrate something much more profound. Veldrin's energy shield began to flicker. The professor, who had spent centuries perfecting his ability to control his environment, now found himself at a loss. He had expected this to be an easy test, a way to put the human in his place. But as Ethan raised his sword, the professor realized his mistake. This wasn't a simple challenge. It was a lesson in humility. Ethan's movements were slow but deliberate, a silent acknowledgement of the strength he was about to demonstrate. The professor had assumed that humans could not keep up with the galaxy's advanced civilizations, but now, in front of the entire class, Ethan was showing him that humanity's strength was not something to be underestimated. It wasn't in their intellect nor their military might, but in their sheer willpower to survive, to stand firm in the face of the unimaginable. With one final movement, Ethan lowered the sword. The gesture wasn't one of submission, but of control. In that moment, it became clear to the professor, human strength wasn't about attacking or dominating. It was about standing your ground when everything around you was set to crumble. Professor Veldrin's energy shield began to dim, his confidence cracking as he realized that Ethan had just shown him something far more powerful than mere words or intellectual tactics. Humanity's greatest strength was not in their ability to engage in calculated diplomacy. It was in their ability to endure. And that was something Veldrin would never forget. Ethan hadn't fought. He hadn't drawn blood or engaged in combat. He had proved his point simply by standing firm, showing the professor that there was strength in restraint, in understanding when to fight, and when to let your presence speak for you. The class was still. Professor Veldrin's eyes locked with Ethan's, and for the first time, the alien professor truly understood. Ethan had won, not by defeating him physically, but by teaching him a lesson he would never forget. The professor's miscalculation had led to one of the most powerful lessons of all. Strength is not about violence, but about knowing when to fight, when to yield, and how to adapt. The tension in the room was thick, the stillness almost suffocating. Ethan McCallister stood in front of Professor Veldrin, his sword still lowered in an act of quiet dominance. The professor's once glowing energy shield had dimmed, its power flickering like a dying light. The alien students around them watched in stunned silence, unable to look away from the profound change unfolding before them. It wasn't the raw power of the sword that had shifted the room's atmosphere, but the simple presence of Ethan himself. Veldrin, standing rigidly with his forearms crossed, remained silent. His normally confident demeanor had been replaced by something far more vulnerable. He had expected to teach a lesson in diplomacy, a lesson that would show humanity's weakness and inability to engage in rational thought. Instead, he had just been forced to confront a fundamental truth. Humans didn't need to rely on tactics or intellectual superiority to assert their place in the galaxy. They had something far more profound, the will to endure. The professor's mind raced as he reviewed the events. Ethan hadn't justified him. He had shown him that true strength was not always a matter of power or intellect. It was about knowing when to act and when to stand firm. The professor had made the mistake of underestimating humanity. He had treated them as little more than survivalist creatures, incapable of understanding the complexities of diplomacy. But here, before him, was a human who had done more than just survive. He had shown the professor a new way of seeing the world. Veldrin exhaled slowly. His chest rose and fell with the weight of the realization. Humanity had earned his respect, And for the first time in many years, the professor wasn't sure how to proceed. He had been bested, not in physical combat, but in something deeper. He had been shown the limits of his own thinking, his belief that intellect and diplomacy were the only measures of strength. Turning to face his students, Veldrin spoke, but this time, his voice lacked its usual authority. There was a humility to it, a vulnerability that none of the students had ever heard before. "Class," he began, his tone uncharacteristically somber. "Today I learned something invaluable." He paused, as if gathering his thoughts. "Ethan McCallister has just demonstrated something that transcends intellect. He has shown us that true strength is not in the ability to talk, but in knowing when to act, when to endure, and when to fight for what is necessary." There was a moment of silence before the murmurs started among the students. Some were still processing the lesson they had just witnessed, while others were slowly coming to terms with the fact that humanity's reputation in the galaxy was far from what they had assumed. Ethan McCallister had just proven that humanity's strength wasn't in their ability to hold diplomatic talks, but in their resilience, their ability to stand up in the face of overwhelming odds. The alien students had been raised on stories of their species' intellectual prowess, their species' unparalleled ability to reason and calculate. They had been taught that peace was achieved through discussions, that intelligence and restraint were the hallmarks of a superior civilization. But watching Ethan's quiet strength, they realized that survival, a trait that had long been disregarded by the galaxy's more civilized races, was not something to be underestimated. Ethan turned his gaze to the professor, meeting his eyes with the same calm and steady demeanor. His sword, now back at his side, was no longer a weapon of aggression, but a symbol of human resilience. "Professor," Ethan said softly, "it's not about avoiding conflict. Sometimes it's about understanding when it's time to act and when to show restraint." The words resonated deeply with the professor. For all his years of experience, for all the galactic political maneuvering he had witnessed, he had never encountered something like this, a human teaching him the true meaning of strength. Not brute force, not intellect, but human will, the ability to keep going, to keep fighting, to keep surviving, even when everything else seemed to be stacked against them. Veldrin took a deep breath. "I was wrong," he admitted, looking at Ethan with newfound respect. "You've shown me that strength is not defined by what we know, but by how we adapt and how we survive." It was a humble admission, but it was a significant one. For the first time, Professor Veldrin saw humanity in a new light. His species had prided themselves on peaceful existence and intellectual superiority, but in doing so, they had failed to see the incredible power of perseverance. And now, with the lessons of today still fresh in his mind, he understood that humanity had something the galaxy couldn't ignore, an unbreakable will. The alien students watched, many still trying to process the events they had witnessed. They had seen the strength of intellect, the beauty of strategy, but now they had seen something entirely different. Humanity was not just a survivor of chaos, they were the embodiment of it. As the class ended, Professor Veldrin dismissed his students, his mind still whirring with the implications of the lesson he had learned. As they filed out of the room, some gave Ethan nods of respect, while others exchanged glances, realizing that the perception of humanity had shifted forever. Ethan walked out of the classroom as well, the weight of his sword now light against his side. His mission was simple. He wasn't here to prove humanity's superiority over other species. He was here to prove that humanity's true strength wasn't just in surviving. It was in embracing what made them different. And today, he had done just that. The days that followed the confrontation in Professor Veldrin's classroom were quieter, but the impact of that moment lingered like a quiet storm over the entire academy. Ethan McCallister had unknowingly shattered the professor's carefully constructed views of humanity and their place in the galaxy. What had started as a simple diplomatic exercise in the classroom had evolved into something far more profound, a lesson not only for the professor, but for every student who had witnessed it. For Professor Veldrin, the journey toward understanding had been unexpected, even humbling. He had spent his life teaching that diplomacy was about control, intellect, and restraint. But Ethan had shown him a truth that Veldrin could no longer ignore. Strength did not come from silence or the ability to avoid conflict. It came from the will to endure, to act when necessary, and to survive against all odds. In the weeks that followed, Veldran adjusted his teaching, his once rigid ideals now tempered with the wisdom of survival. He found himself seeking out Ethan after classes, not to challenge him further, but to engage in meaningful conversations that went beyond galactic politics or the textbook versions of diplomacy. Now, they spoke about human history, the resilience built into every human's bones, and the many lessons humanity had learned through hardship. Ethan had not only earned his professor's respect, he had altered the trajectory of his teaching career. For the students, it was no different. The other aliens, who had once viewed humans as brash and impulsive, now understood that there was more to humanity than what met the eye. Many of them came to Ethan, offering respectful nods and words of acknowledgement. The Zareth, the peaceful species who prided themselves on intellect, began to approach him with more thoughtful inquiries, asking for his insight on topics that went beyond the scope of traditional diplomacy. They realized after watching Ethan that there was a pragmatism to humanity's approach to survival that they hadn't seen before. The legacy of that day rippled far beyond the classroom walls. Humanity was no longer viewed through the narrow lens of chaotic conflict and unrefined brutality. Instead, they were recognized for their depth, their resilience, and their ability to learn, adapt, and survive. Ethan's actions had proven that there was strength in humanity's will, a strength that no amount of intellectual debate could ever undermine. In the quiet moments after class, as Ethan walked the halls of the academy, he felt the weight of those lessons, both the ones he had taught and the ones he had learned. He was just one person in a universe full of species, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. But he knew one thing for certain. Humanity's legacy was not one of violence or war. It was a legacy of endurance, of standing tall in the face of adversity and never backing down. And with every step he took, Ethan carried that legacy forward. He would not be the one to start wars or end them with a sword. His fight would always be for the survival of his species, for the lessons learned through hardship, and for the future of humanity, a future built on the foundation of strength, resilience, and the unyielding will to rise again, no matter how many times they were knocked down. The galaxy would never forget the day when a human student stood up in front of a galactic professor and reminded the galaxy that true strength was not in words or delicate diplomacy, but in knowing when to fight and when to endure. The battle wasn't just about proving who was stronger. It was about teaching the galaxy that humanity would always be ready, no matter what challenges lay ahead. And so, the lesson was passed on not just to Professor Veldran, but to an entire galaxy that would now look at humanity with a new understanding, one that would forever change how they viewed the human race.